Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. I've worked backstage in WWE for over a decade. I've seen things most fans wouldn't believe. Injuries so bad you'd think bones were made of paper. Fights that made what happens in the ring look like child's play. Wrestlers breaking down under the weight of fame. But what happened that night in New Orleans in 2017? That was different. That was something else. That night, I was assigned to the gorilla position, the small area just behind the curtain where wrestlers wait before making their entrance. It's a nerve center. The air is thick with tension, adrenaline, and the lingering scent of sweat and anxiety. Wrestlers pace, muttering final words to themselves, cracking their necks, bouncing on their toes. Some pray, some stand in complete silence. It's an electric place, always buzzing. But that night, the air felt wrong. I didn't notice it at first, too focused on my headset, listening to the producer's instructions. The show was running smoothly, match after match rolling like a well-oiled machine. Then came the main event. That's when I saw him. He was standing just beyond the lights, deep in the shadows where the glow from the monitors barely reached. A tall man in a wrestling singlet, his head tilted down slightly, the way wrestlers do when they're mentally preparing for war. I assumed he was one of the competitors, probably deep in thought, maybe running through the match in his head. I had seen this 100 times before. "Hey, you're up next," I said, barely looking at him as I adjusted my headset. He didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge me at all. I frowned. Maybe he didn't hear me. The gorilla position is loud. Commentators yelling in my ear. The crowd roaring beyond the curtain. The sound of the match and the ring thudding through the speakers. I took a step closer. "Hey man, you good?" Still nothing. That's when a hand clamped onto my shoulder from behind. I jumped. "What are you doing?" It was another crew member, a younger guy, maybe mid-20s. I gestured toward the shadowy figure. "He's up next, right?" The crew guy looked at me like I had lost my damn mind. "Oh." I turned back, and the figure was gone. Gone. There was nowhere for him to go. No side doors. No easy way to slip past me without being seen. He had been right there. I felt something cold crawl down my spine. I didn't have time to think about it. The show went on, and I forced myself to focus, but the feeling, the heavy, pressing wrongness of that moment never left me. After the event, I found myself lingering backstage, unable to shake the memory of that silent figure. I described him to one of the old-timers, a guy who had been with WWE longer than I'd been alive. As soon as I finished, his face drained of color. "That sounds like Chris Benoit," he muttered. I laughed. It was a nervous, awkward laugh, because the way he said it made my stomach turn. "No way," I said. "Benoit's been gone for what? A decade?" But the moment I said it, doubt crept in. The shape, the stance, the silence, it matched. I didn't sleep that night. I went down a rabbit hole instead, looking at old footage, old photos. And then I found one. A still shot from one of Benoit's last matches. The singlet, the stance, the way his head was tilted down, just like the man I had seen in Gorilla. I didn't tell anyone else. What could I say? That I saw a dead man waiting for his entrance? That I watched him stand there in the shadows? ready to step into a ring that would never welcome him again. I don't know what I saw that night. I tell myself it was just a trick of the light, a case of exhaustion, a mix-up, a moment of overactive imagination. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I see that figure again, standing just beyond the lights, waiting. And I wonder if he's still there. Story 2. A few years back, I was working as a road agent, traveling from town to town, making sure the matches went off without a hitch. You get used to the grind, different cities, same routine, but there are places that stick with you, places that sink into your bones. One of those places was an old arena in Ohio, a dusty relic that had seen better days. It hadn't hosted a WWE event in decades, and by the look of it, time had not been kind. The parking lot was cracked with weeds poking through the asphalt, and the marquee out front still had faded letters from an old boxing event. The second we stepped inside, I knew something was off. The air was heavy, like a weight pressing against my chest. The place smelled of damp wood and something else, something stale and sour, like sweat that had seeped into the walls long ago and never left. Some of the veteran wrestlers joked about the place being haunted, swapping stories about eerie sounds and cold spots in the hallways. We laughed it off. It was just another rundown building, another night of work. But deep down, I felt something watching us. Then came the locker room incident. Jake was one of the newer guys, hungry to make a name for himself. He was young, in great shape, always the first to hit the gym and the last to leave the ring. That night, he was set to work a dark match before the main card. I was going over the schedule when I heard a loud bang from the hallway. It sounded like a bench had been thrown across the room. A few of us rushed over and found Jake standing in the middle of the old locker room, frozen like a deer in headlights. His face had drained of all color, his hands clenched at his sides. His gaze was fixed on the mirror across from him. What happened? I asked. Jake's breathing was ragged, his chest rising and falling like he'd just run a marathon. He didn't answer right away. He just kept staring at the mirror. "There's someone in here with me," he whispered. I felt the hair on my arm stand up. I looked around, checked behind the lockers, under the benches. Nothing. The room was empty except for us. "You probably heard something from the hallway," I told him. Jake shook his head violently. He lifted his hand and pointed at the mirror. I saw him standing right behind me. The way he said it, his voice hollow and distant, made my stomach tighten. I turned and looked at the mirror myself. It was old, its edges chipped and darkened with age. My own reflection stared back at me, my face pale under the fluorescent light. And then, for just a second, I saw something else. It was a shape, a shadow, standing just behind us. Not my reflection, not Jake's, something else entirely. It was gone in a blink, like it had never been there. But I knew what I saw. Jake let out a shaky breath. "You saw it, didn't you?" I didn't want to admit it. Not out loud. We got the hell out of there. Jake refused to wrestle that night. The next morning, he packed his bags and left the company altogether. No explanation. No goodbye. A few weeks later, I told one of the older guys what had happened. He gave me a long, unreadable look before shaking his head. "You don't know about the incident?" he asked. I told him I didn't. He sighed and leaned in, lowering his voice like he didn't want anyone else to hear. "In the early 90s, A wrestler had a heart attack in that locker room, died before his match. The poor bastard was sitting right in front of that same mirror when it happened. They found him slumped over, eyes wide open. I felt my stomach turn. Some say he never left. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still see that dark shape in the mirror. Watching, waiting, and every time I step into a new arena, I check the mirrors, because some doors once opened never really close. Story 3. It was the kind of night that makes you feel alive. The lights were blinding, the crowd was deafening, and the energy inside the arena pulsed like a living thing. I had scored a great seat near the barricade for SmackDown, right where the wrestlers get slammed into the steel. The air smelled of popcorn, sweat, and something metallic. Maybe the steel beams, maybe blood. I had been waiting for this night for months. A chance to escape real life for a few hours and lose myself in the spectacle. The show was electric. The crowd roared as the superstars made their entrances, each one more theatrical than the last. But somewhere around the second match, I noticed something that made the air feel a little colder. An old man. He was sitting in the front row, directly across from me, just behind the timekeeper's area. At first, he didn't seem out of place, until I realized he wasn't moving, not cheering, not even blinking, just sitting there, staring at the ring. His face was lined, his skin pale and almost waxy under the bright lights. He had on an old WWE t-shirt, one of those vintage ones from the 80s, faded and loose on his thin frame. His hands rested on his knees, fingers curled slightly, like he was waiting for something. I don't know how long I had been staring before I nudged the guy next to me. "Do you see that old man?" I asked, pointing across the barricade. "Oh, the guy in the front row right there. The one just sitting still." He followed my finger, squinting. "I don't see anybody, dude." I laughed nervously. "He's right there, man. Front row, behind the timekeeper. Looks like he hasn't blinked in an hour." The guy gave me a weird look and turned back to the ring. I tried to shake it off. Maybe the guy was just deep in thought. Maybe he had a health condition. Or maybe, just maybe, he was so focused on the match that he didn't react like the rest of us. But something about him made my stomach twist. Every time I glanced back at him, his eyes were locked on the ring, expressionless, motionless. And yet, there was something in the way he stared, like he was longing for something. Then, just before the commercial break, I glanced at him again, and he was gone. Not he got up and left gone. Not he went to the bathroom gone. Just gone. 1 second, he was there. The next, his seat was empty. I looked around, expecting to see him walking up the stairs, heading toward the concessions, but there was no sign of him. The seat was completely vacant. I turned back to the guy next to me. "Did you see where that old man went?" He shook his head without looking at me. Something about that empty chair made my skin crawl. I flagged down the security guard standing near the barricade. "Hey, did you see where that old guy in the front row went?" The guard frowned. "What old guy?" I pointed again, my mouth suddenly dry. "The one sitting right there." The guard followed my finger, then shook his head. "That seat's been empty all night." "No," I said, my voice coming out weaker than I intended. "No, I saw him. He was sitting there for most of the show, right behind the timekeeper." The guard looked at me for a long moment. "Maybe you saw something else." Then he turned back to the ring, dismissing me like I was some overexcited fan. I sat back in my chair, heart pounding. I knew what I saw. I knew he had been there. And yet his seat was empty, like he had never existed at all. The rest of the night felt off. The matches continued. The crowd screamed. The lights flashed. But I felt disconnected from it all. I kept glancing at that seat, waiting for him to reappear. He didn't. By the time the main event ended, I was feeling sick. Something about the whole thing had my brain tangled in knots. I needed answers. So when I got back to my hotel, I did what anyone would do. I checked Twitter. I typed in SmackDown front row old man and started scrolling. And that's when I found it. A post from 2003. A fan had posted about seeing an old man sitting in the front row, staring at the ring, never cheering, never blinking. They described him exactly the way I had seen him. And the scariest part? They said he vanished right before the main event. I felt my blood turn to ice. I kept scrolling, clicking on links, searching through old Reddit threads, trying to understand what I'd seen. And I wasn't the only one. There were reports from 2015, 2010, even back in 1997. Different shows, different arenas, always the same description. An old man, sitting in the front row, never cheering, never moving, always disappearing before the main event. Some say he was a lifelong fan who died at a WWE show decades ago. Others believe he's still watching, waiting for one last match. I don't know what I saw that night. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was some kind of mass hysteria among wrestling fans over the years. But every time I watch a live event, every time the camera cuts to the front row, I find myself searching. And sometimes, just for a split second, I think I see him, still watching, still waiting, and still absolutely silent.